Yeah. Welcome, everyone. We are going to touch real quick today, helping ourselves and our communities understand what is happening with immigration right now, what's happening at the border, what's the ways the news is talking about it, trying to make sense of how this fits into history as we like to do with Be the Bridge. So I have two of the most fantastic guests on with me today. I have Professor Jennifer Koh, who is calling in from the gorgeous Pepperdine University, where she is a law professor there and immigration. And also Michelle Farino Warren is with us, and you you're a policy expert. You do lots of advocating around multiple issues, but also for our interest today around immigration. So welcome, ladies. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you,
Um,
Elizabeth. It's great to
Thank
be here.
you.
Absolutely. So first, I'd love to just start off with, it feels like the border is in the news every week right now. There's lots happening there. We just saw a couple weeks ago about a young man, a 17-year-old who died in custody, and then last week an 8-year-old died in custody. We've heard on and off, are we going to have a large influx of immigrants, or are we not? And are they in custody? I feel like it's all over the map. Can you give us just a little context for why you think the border is being talked about so heavily right now? Is this new for there to be all of these issues and things happening at the border, or is it just now on our radar?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start, although I always appreciate Jennifer's perspective as an immigration attorney and somebody who lives in Southern California. I live in Denver, Colorado, and so I'm typically like at second migration city. And right now we have a huge influx of Venezuelan migrants. We've taken about 10,000 since December. And so there's just a lot of different local dynamics. But I've been working on immigration for a couple of decades and on immigration policy and organizing and advocacy. And I will say probably with a tremendously large amount of confidence that there's always a lot of things happening at the border, and that it is a really contentious conversation of who can come in, how we're going to regulate flow. And I think when you have numbers, there's a story there because it plays into some really honest questions like, can our country sustain more people? What are we supposed to do as Christians? But I know we're going to get into some of the weeds, but I think it's just really important to note that all around the world people move. And our border is not all that different than a lot of borders all over the world. And that 2023 doesn't look all that different than 2020 or 2014. And there's just surges. And actually May and June is a big time where you find a lot of people coming just because of traveling and the practicality. So yeah, we'll just stop there. But it's definitely people move, and we're hearing the story of the people who are moving now.
That makes a lot of sense.
And I think that's such an important point that migration is a reality. It's in particular a reality now. The United Nations has noted that we are at a time in history where the number of people who are displaced or who are refugees seeking their home countries is at an all-time high. The United States is not the only place where people go, but it is a place where people go, and is one of the wealthiest countries in the world, and as a country that has legal obligations to allow people to come to our borders and to ask for safety in our country, and in a place where people have family. It makes sense that people come to the United States. In response to your direct question, I think one of the reasons, just practically why the border has been, in the news right now has involved the end of a program called Title 42. It was started at the start of the pandemic and was a public health measure that enabled authorities to just basically shut down the border and more or less end the ability of people to exercise that legal and historic right to seek asylum. There's a lot more to say. Honestly, Title 42 should have ended long ago at the time at which our country and world was equipped to handle the public health crisis. So it continued long after the public health crisis had ended for political reasons, for all kinds of, there are all kinds of factors. that affected the continuation of that policy. But I mean, absolutely, like migration has been a reality from biblical times up until the present, and how we respond to it and whether we choose to make it a crisis, that's a human choice.
Yeah. I think one thing that's sort of distinct, and you can look at that through the timeline, just not of now, but over the years, is right now there are just a lot of people from Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, and Haiti. And back, I remember in 2014, it was more the Northern Triangle. And so sometimes what you'll see is while people are always on the move, and we definitely have different swells, a lot of times countries there people are from all over the world are at our borders, but we're seeing really large swells right now in these four countries, which makes it a little historic in the sense that the governments in those countries have all but shut down. And asylum, which is it's a high bar, but you have to have a credible fear of persecution for religion, political thoughts and ideas. So if in those countries right now, if you have any opposition to your government, you can be imprisoned, you can be killed. And so we're seeing swells from, I guess we call those push factors. There's push factors and pull factors. And right now, while there's always people on the move, whether it's because of changes in the environment, and that's a whole other reason for migration wars, but we're seeing a lot at our particular border: Venezuela, Nicaragua, Haiti, and Cuba.
That's really interesting. What would you say when we think about putting this sort of in a historical context, sort of like the history of the border, the history of U.S. involvement with those countries where we see such an influx? What has been the U.S.'s role in either creating or mitigating these various crises that happen over time?
Yeah, I mean, the world is absolutely interconnected, and the United States as a global superpower has influence abroad. I think the one country that I would just add to that list is Afghanistan as well. There's this great piece in the New York Times that just came out on Afghan nationals who have literally traveled through just across the world, who directly supported the United States government in their country. That's a really stark example, but you also have the United States involvement in Central America, right? There's a level of responsibility that we share, and that countries have always shared across borders, but that countries with power in particular have shared in. So, I mean, that is absolutely a significant consideration. It's not a legal one, right? There's nothing like in US law that says that, if the US has had a role in creating the conditions, right, that like cause people to migrate here, that will somehow enable them to, achieve status. But as a moral imperative, that's something for us to think about, right? Like, how does responsibility work? How does accountability work, right? What does it mean to live in community that extends, beyond just like our constructed borders?
Yeah. Jennifer, as you were talking, I was just thinking about just the whole creation of asylum and refugees, back after World War II. So we're talking about this historic time of displacement. The world has not seen numbers of people displaced. Some of it is because we have more people, but also there are just so many things that are happening in the world that the last several years, you just continue to hear this is an unprecedented time and the numbers continue to grow. But the last time we saw a really huge swell historically was actually after World War II. There
Mhm.
was so many displaced people, and a lot of people were trying to flee because of political and religious persecution, and they could not get across borders in Europe. They could not get to the United States, and consequently, many people, because they didn't have the opportunity to ask for safety, were killed. And so after World War II, the League of Nations, ends and the United Nations begins. And all of a sudden, it really came in Europe, this conversation is, if it was ever a time in history again where powers were to come up and people who, because of their religious or their political ideology, had to flee, could we create some type of process? And that's where, this is a very watered down version of it, but that's sort of the idea of refugee and asylum global agreements, and the United States was a part of it. And Jennifer, you might help me remember, I think it was in the 80s, we finally signed on to all of it, saying, yes, we will be a part of that solution. We will be a part of this global camaraderie that we want to accept people at our borders for asylum, that we want to be a part of this refugee process, and we'll create money in our budgets, and we'll create policy so that, and rules, mostly rules, so that this could take place. And that's just a really important time in history for sure, which is why we have even asylum and refugee as a category.
Absolutely. As within Be the Bridge, doing racial literacy work, racial reconciliation work, sometimes people want to try to move the conversation about immigration outside of that conversation about race. Personally, I don't see how the two can be unentwined from one another. But if either of you would like to share sort of where you see, like, where that overlap is, whether historically or presently.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you brought that up. We're undergoing a period in our country right now where racial justice is fraught, it's difficult, and yet it is so necessary, right? Grappling with our history and just where we are as a multiracial society, but also one that has really been marked by the stain of white supremacy, and that's been like a very violent history and also a violent present. So I guess there's a lot to say, but I would say that, like, if we can sort of disentangle immigration and racial discrimination from like legal concepts and just think about it as people, right? When we create policies that force people into living conditions by the border where they are just forced to wait for months in really inhumane conditions, and where the vast majority of those people are people of color, like, what does that do to our perception of like what an appropriate response to the human needs of people are, right? You take the example of Ukraine and our response to the war in Ukraine and the need of refugees it was appropriate, it was humane, it reflected a competent government that had the capacity, right, to process people and bring people in. I don't mean to say like process people as other products or something. And in a way that did not sort of create crisis, right? But when you saw the media coverage initially of what was happening in Ukraine, right, you heard these reporters saying, oh, look at these people, they're just like us, we need to do something, the world needs to do something. And it's such a stark contrast to how we have treated individuals from all over the rest of the world, right? And there's a history behind that. Immigration has been used as a proxy for race throughout history. Our very first immigration laws and just fundamental immigration law doctrine, like the understandings that have really been at the basis of our immigration law system, we're really premised on this idea that America is a nation for Europeans, and it is, a place where, in particular, Chinese individuals and people of Asian descent, right, can never become members, and where like the racial discrimination in immigration law is perfectly appropriate and the courts will not intervene. So that's our history, and yet still we very much have these like present day realities to grapple with. And it's not just the border, it's immigration detention, right? Who do we believe it is appropriate to place in cages and jails on civil charges, right? In a civil system? Who do we deport? What are the families that we think it is appropriate to separate? Right, there are not maybe necessarily clear answers. It's not that, people are necessarily acting in a manner where they're like trying to, engage in racial discrimination per se, but it seems to me impossible to separate out just the realities of immigration law today from who we are as a country that has not yet been able to honestly and fully grapple with our racial stratification. So those are just a couple of thoughts. I'll let Michelle jump in as well.
I was going to say, Jennifer, there's so much that you have just laid out, and there's so many different things that I could jump on. I guess I'll just say I have an opportunity to adjunct at Denver Seminary, have for many years. And in addition to teaching political advocacy, I also teach a class called Social Concerns and Community Development. And I bring that up because when you look at social concerns and the vulnerability of people, you want to see, what makes a person vulnerable? How do people end up in the places that they end up? And there's really only three streams that create any type of social concern. The first stream is poverty. If you're poor, you're going to be more susceptible to having social concerns, lack of access to healthcare, education. I don't want to list all the social concerns, but you can understand people who are poor, are more at risk for that kind of those impacts. The second is immigration. Immigrants, are more vulnerable because they're on the move. There's a reason people are moving. Sometimes it's because they are poor and they're seeking. Sometimes, they're obviously leaving for other reasons. And the third is racism. What I think is important, just as a Christian, is when you look at the two streams of immigration and poverty, you see the Old Testament laws really look out for that. There's a lot to be said about how you're going to treat the poor, the widow, the orphan, the immigrant. We often refer to that as the quartet of the vulnerable. And so I want to talk about racism because I don't think you can't take it out. It is a driving factor, and the church is actually where I wouldn't say they're the establishment of human hierarchy, but you can go back to papal documents that really set human hierarchy as though that somehow was the mission of the church, was this holy colonization. And so I just go back to those three streams. Is racism is a human construct, but we see it at the fall, where just, as a consequence of the fall, you see who's going to be greater than who. We see it in a man and woman, husband and wife relationship, but it really is much bigger than that. And this idea that someone's going to rule and you're going to want to come under, and we'll have this constant tension of who is superior. And so I think that is just a consequence of the fall. And we need to be very aware of that. So when you think of those three streams, in the idea of human hierarchy, you recognize that we think that the poor are less than as humans. We think that the immigrant, they don't speak our language, they don't understand our culture, somehow they must not be as smart, like we're better or more superior. And then we have created this human construct of race, whereas on human hierarchy, depending on the color of your skin, the way your eyes look, just different physical characteristics, somehow there's a superiority as a result of physical things that you've inherited. What's fascinating about those three streams is that they're not independent of each other, that there's multiple marginalizations, that if you are poor and you are an immigrant and you are a person of color. Jennifer, thank you for bringing up Ukraine, because we've seen even in recent history how fast we move for Europeans versus how slow we move, even to Afghans. Those were some of this, they weren't similar, but this sort of similar dynamics, right? And all of a sudden, how fast everything moved for Ukrainians. And yet with Afghans, we're still struggling, all of even these years later, and trying to get people who were helpful, that people who need to be here, that we owe a debt of gratitude and need to guarantee their safety. We're still struggling. So I think just as Christians, we need to be mindful of those three streams, how they intersect, and not, I often get people will push back. I don't know about you all, but it's like, Michelle, why do you make everything about race? Well, it kind of is. I mean, human hierarchy is just, we don't even know how deep it is in our water. And I don't mean our physical water, but our water and everything that we've grown up under. We don't even see our own blindnesses for preferential treatment around human hierarchy and people's physical characteristics. So there's no way to separate it. But we need to be acknowledging of that, the human-made construct of race within the very present poverty and immigration, creating concerns that we as the church and as Christians need to, throw off all of that human tendency and run towards being peacemakers and trying to reconcile a broken world.
Absolutely. We're running low on time here. I want to close out with one last question though, because we are talking to a community who refer to themselves as bridge builders, who want to break out of the cultural norms of ways of thinking and engaging this conversation. What can we be doing? What are ways we can be thinking about this? Things we can be advocating for, conversations we could be having with other people, that can, that do question can go a lot of different ways, but what does it look like to be a bridge builder in this moment in time with what is happening, with immigration and with the conversation and around it?
I guess I'll start us off. I mean, there's always things to do, right? There's sort of like awareness to raise and money to raise and donate and give. And I guess I would ask folks to listen carefully beyond just what maybe some of the major media headlines are saying, even some of the media that we might kind of label as liberal or progressive media. I would actually ask folks to listen to maybe what some advocates and immigrants are witnessing on the ground and the perspectives of people who have been working in the immigration space for a really long time, and see what they have to say about the current situation. Really practically, I'll direct folks to an organization, the Haitian Bridge Alliance. Is led by my dear friend Gerline Joseph. She's a woman of God, a follower of Christ. They just conducted a fact-finding mission and released a report on some of their findings together with major international human rights organizations on some of the things that are happening. And they have also really, kind of articulated very well their concerns about racism, in particular anti-Black racism around the border. Another organization, the American Immigration Council, has set forth a really detailed set of suggestions around how border policy could be more effectively revised. So I guess I would say listen, but kind of listen beyond some of the sound bites and what just elected officials and mainstream media might be saying.
Yeah, agreed. I think there's a couple other things to pay attention to as well. And I would add just another organization is KIND, Kids in Need of Defense. I just think they do incredible work and have really helped. They're just a great place to learn specifically around the impact of migration with children, and just really some really great people there. I think another thing is that we do need money. And, I know in Denver, we're pretty maxed out on legal fees. People need help. Asylum is a legal way forward, and it costs money. And I know Jennifer, one of the ways I got connected to her was, she just had so much vision around the Orange County immigrant fund. Isn't
Orange County Justice Fund.
Justice Fund. Sorry, I couldn't remember, but I just remember it's like, oh, it's just like not sitting around, like we're gonna raise money for actually helping people. So in addition to kind of paying attention to what's happening, find the organizations that are doing the investment. And usually, I mean, when you're a bridge builder, that means you're not in a sedentary place. And sometimes we think, oh, should we be bridging to people who are just really hard-hearted about things, and maybe that's where we should be bridging. I would say, yeah, there's always that possibility, but I think before you bridge there, you really need a bridge to people who are directly impacted. I have a lot to say about proximity. You cannot fix problems you don't understand, and you're never going to truly understand them, even if you've got the best resources, as far as learning. I mean, we should be educated people, but really learning from people themselves directly, and really trying to find organizations and churches and being in relationship with people who can help you shed a very personal story. And I certainly don't want to, force people to be co-opted for their story. I'm not saying that. I just want to make sure that the conversation about immigration doesn't just stay in the political and the news realm. It has got to be personal. If you're a bridge builder, then you are talking about a very personal and confronting work. And I would also just say, and that's how I got involved in immigration policy, was I was just a neighbor to immigrants, and I've lived in an immigrant neighborhood, and there's a beauty in proximity, but there's also a call to the work of resistance, because injustice doesn't just happen. And so you need to be willing to join your community and fight for justice together. So, those are just a few things that I would probably add to what Jennifer was sharing.
Well, those are fantastic. And thank you, ladies, both so much for your time today. I know this will have been helpful for our listeners, for our bridge builders. And we look forward to following your work and seeing what comes here in the future on how we can engage this more.